Welcome to 2819. This is the show where we aim to inspire you to go and make disciples of all nations. I'm Sandra Dimes.
And I'm Krista Bontrager. And this is the television outreach of Reasons to Believe.
And as you're watching the show, if you want to support resources like 2819, visit reasons.org/2819 and give us some support, please.
And I want to encourage you, if you're watching us on YouTube, be sure to hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you can receive alerts when we post new episodes.
And if you want to stay connected with us, find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. We're at 2819 Show. We would love to hear from you.
And the podcast version of this show is available on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, and Spotify. Just search for Reasons to Believe Podcast.
And now it's time for a quick rundown. In our Nexus segment, we're going to hear from philosopher and theologian Kenneth Samples, and he's going to address the question, what is the Old Testament basis for believing in the Trinity?
Very commonly misunderstood issue, so I'm glad we're tackling that.
Yeah, definitely. In our Culture Talk segment, I'm going to be talking about the inspirational ministry of Johnny Cash. I'm going to talk with maybe you.
Maybe the biggest
Cash fan, absolutely. And then in our Give and Take segment, Jeff Zwerig will talk with molecular biologist Anjeanette Roberts about should we wipe out malaria?
Oh, that's a great question.
Right.
I can't wait to hear that.
Yeah.
And in our RTB 101 segment today, Sia is going to be filling in for me, and she's going to be talking to Hugh Ross about the question, does the Bible teach us to be vegetarians? Can't wait to hear that.
Let's check it out.
Now it's the time for RTB 101. This is the segment where we talk about practical questions to equip our viewers to share their faith with their friends and family more effectively. I'm here to talk about a very common question with Dr. Hugh Ross. And Hugh, I noticed that when reading the book of Genesis, that in the beginning, it sounds like we were supposed to have been vegetarians. Is that so?
Well, at the end of Genesis chapter 1, it talks about how God provides green plants, green vegetation for us and for all life. Because that's in the context of God telling Adam and Eve and all of humanity, I'm putting you in charge of the whole planet, manage its resources for your benefit and the benefit of all life. And you better take care of the green vegetation because that's the base of the food chain. You don't take care of that, nobody gets to eat.
Now, but it seems like towards the end of the book of Genesis, that you see God changing his mind, and now suddenly he's saying you can eat meat. So what is that about?
Well, it's referring to human beings. It's explicitly for human beings, saying you were in a vegetarian diet, now you can also eat meat. And he's basically explaining to them, you're not going to live long enough for it to make any difference. And the context is this: before the flood, people had the potential to live 800 or 900 years.
Wow.
When you eat meat, you put heavy metals into your body at a rate of about 10,000 times if you restrict your diet to vegetable matter. And if you're only going to live to be 100 or 120, it's not going to make any difference. But if you're going to live to be 800 or 900, the accumulation of those heavy metals in your body will bring about death from cancer and other sources. So God is basically saying, now that you're only going to live to be a maximum of 120 years, it's okay to eat meat.
He says it's okay to eat meat, but I'm curious with how we were designed. Were we designed to be vegetarians? I mean, even people will point out that our teeth are obviously like herbivore teeth. And so would it be better for us to be vegetarians?
Well, we're omnivores. I mean, if you look at our digestive tract, it's a lot like the digestive tract of mice and rats, in the sense that we can eat vegetable matter, we can also eat meat. So we're able to have a diverse diet. So that's how our bodies were designed. But if we're going to live to be 900 years, we have to avoid eating meat. But now we're only going to live a maximum of 120. Eating meat's okay, and guess what? Our bodies are designed for that omnivorous diet.
Okay.
I mean, in terms of our mouth, our teeth, our digestive tract, it's not designed like a cow to be living only on vegetable matter. It's actually designed for a very wide diet spectrum.
Okay. So we actually are designed to have meat and vegetables.
Yes.
Okay, I had actually heard the opposite. That's very interesting.
Well, there's certain amino acids that are crucial for your health. They're extremely difficult to get if you don't have some kind of access to meat or eggs or milk.
Okay. Another thing that I've heard is that before the fall, all animals were herbivores. And so do you think that that's a good conversation to start with my unbelieving friends?
Well, a lot of your unbelieving friends will think that's what Genesis is saying, and that's where it's important to go to Genesis 9, and that's when God says to Noah about now you can eat meat. It's clear from the context it's referring to the human species. So it's not something saying that all animals were vegetarian and then suddenly after the fall you had carnivores. And it's a simple fact of ecology. If you don't have carnivores, the herbivores suffer, and they suffer dramatically. To keep life balanced, given the laws of physics, it's crucial that the herbivores have carnivores. The health and the death rate of the herbivores skyrockets without carnivores. And I think there you need to understand, we're a unique carnivore. We can kill anything we want. And so typically when we hunt, we go after the best within the herd. But all the other carnivores on the planet don't have that luxury. They're only able to feed on the weak, the sick, the dying, and the injured. And through that process, they actually protect the health and the longevity of the herbivores that they feed upon.
Thank you so much, Hugh. To learn more about interesting information like this, go to reasons.org and search today's new reasons to believe. Now it's time for our Nexus segment. This week, we're watching an excerpt from a television interview that Kenneth Samples did on the show Truth Matters. He's talking about the question, what is the Old Testament basis for believing in the Trinity? Let's check it out.
The Trinity, and we explain that to other people, knowing that it is a core Christian doctrine. But people say, well, that seems like it's only in the New Testament, and they don't look to the Old Testament. They don't see how the new is a fulfillment of the Old, and it's actually more accurate sometimes to say Old Covenant and New Covenant to be a little bit more precise about what we find represented there. How does the Trinity relate to the Old Testament Jewish monotheism?
Yeah, very important doctrine, and very important to have an understanding of how it is derived biblically. In terms of the Old Testament, it's certainly true that the Hebrews, Jews, do not accept the Trinity. They believe that God is one being, one person, a more traditional monotheism. But when you look at the Old Testament, for example, the most important creed in the Old Testament is Deuteronomy 6:4. It's called the Shema. Shema means hear, because the verse states, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." So while that creed is often understood as affirming a traditional monotheism, really the Shema can't be understood to include the doctrine of the Trinity. For example, the word God, Elohim, is a quantitative plural, kind of a puzzling idea there, that the one God would include a plurality. Moreover, when it says that God is one, Ehad, it is not a mathematical one. It includes diversity, because in the book of Genesis, Adam and Eve are said to be one flesh. And so the most important statement about God's oneness in the Old Testament can allow for a unity and diversity, a unity of God's nature, plurality of personhood. Now again, Jews don't understand it that way, but the Shema can be taken that way. Furthermore, there are other passages. God is spoken of in the plural in the book of Genesis and other places in the Old Testament. I'm not saying that that has to be a reference to the Trinity, but I am saying that it allows for the doctrine of the Trinity. And there are other places that talk about the angel of the Lord that would seem to imply that there is plurality of personhood within God's one nature.
If you'd like to hear more from Ken Samples, visit reasons.org and search for his Reflections blog. Now it's time for Culture Talk. This is the segment where we talk about the intersection of science, faith, and pop culture, and how culturally relevant topics can be used to start conversations about your faith. I'm joined today with theologian Krista Bontrager.
Happy to be here.
Thank you so much. We're going to talk about the 50th 50th anniversary of the San Quentin album by Johnny Cash.
Johnny Cash, I even wore my shirt.
You did.
I'm glad to see that you've got your
I always
jacket
wear
on.
black. But I mean, it might seem odd that we're even talking about Johnny Cash and an apologetics ministry and show, but let's dive into first why you're such a Johnny Cash fan. Maybe that'll help us unpack why this is relevant.
Yeah. Well, just statistically speaking, he's impressive. He's one of, I like to call him the greatest Christian artist of the 20th century, but he really is one of the greatest artists. He's in both the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and the Country Music Hall of Fame. He's one of the only ones that is in both. But what I like about him is that he really sang about a lot of themes, both related to his understanding of sin and himself as a sinner, a person who struggled with deep sin, but also his encounter with amazing grace. And he was very public about being a Christian and his relationship with Jesus and the role that that had had in his life.
Well, tell us a little bit about that, because maybe people might not know about his religious background. So tell us a little bit more.
Sure, yeah. He was born in Dyess, Arkansas on a sharecropper farm. His father was a sharecropper, and they raised cotton. He joined the military when he was 17 years old, and he went and he was stationed overseas. But he was raised within the environment of a Christian home. He would listen to the Grand Ole Opry on the radio with his family. His mother sang to him hymns. He memorized the hymn book while his brother was memorizing the Bible.
Oh, wow.
And he just would love to sing, and music was a big part of his life, but so was his faith. But when he went off into the military and then rose to fame in rock and roll in the 50s, he started drifting from his faith, and then had quite a kind of reconversion of coming back to his faith when he struggled with drugs.
Wow. So now we're talking about the anniversary of the San Quentin album.
Sure.
Why did Johnny Cash do concerts in prisons, and
Right.
how is that connected to his faith?
Yeah, and it does have a deep connection because he did one prison album. His first one is in 1968. It was Folsom. And then the second one was 1969. It was in San Quentin. But he took literally the verse about visiting those who were in prison, and he saw it as really flowing out of his Christian faith. And he knew that he wanted to really try to live out the words of Jesus. He sang about them, but he also really wanted to live them out. And he was never in prison. That's a common misconception. He did spend a few days in jail for drugs, but he was never in prison. But prisoners identified with him because he was willing to go to them.
Right. And that's such a beautiful example of our faith in action, taking a Bible verse about going and visiting these prisoners and actually doing that, and then doing it in a way that he was gifted. You know, he was able to create and sing great music, so do it in that way.
Yeah.
So let me ask, what's your favorite song on the album?
Oh, wow. That's a tough one. But probably my favorite on that particular album would be the title track of San Quentin, that he wrote actually the day before the concert. He was just so prolific. It's amazing. But he wrote the song about, from the perspective of a prisoner within San Quentin, and just talking about how rough it was on a person's soul, and that impact of prison life really had a distorting effect on the soul of humanity, and wrestling with that. And in the midst of the concert, he always had gospel songs too. And he brought big acts. It wasn't just some podunk show. He brought big name acts with him into the prison environment to sing songs too. And they always did gospel songs as well as the hits from the radio.
So that's such a powerful ministry, to be able to go use your platform to say, I'm going to reach these prisoners and speak truth and speak the gospel and into their hearts and minds and souls. Such a beautiful act for him to do. Now, I want to ask, the reason why we're doing this segment at all is, why do you think someone like Johnny Cash, like his music resonates across multiple generations?
Yeah, that's a great question, because it really does. Like, my daughter enjoys, I've submitted my children to endless Johnny Cash, but they really do like some of the songs on their own. And in their generation, there's been some songs that people identify with. But, you know, he was on the radio for 50 years, a long time. I think what resonates with so many people is the honesty and the authenticity of the music, that he talks about real struggles. It's not like Christian songs you hear on Christian radio today where I think, like, where are these people's problems? He would talk about drug problems and problems with violence and problems of deep difficulty and the flaw of the human condition. He was extremely honest in his songs, but there was also this redemptive element that grace and Jesus was the answer. He's one of the only artists I can think of that could perform for Billy Graham and my grandparents and prisoners.
And prisoners, yeah.
But the gospel is universal, and he is a great example of how to have faith and be in public but still do good art.
Right, and you talked also too about his lyrics and how profound they were. Even the reason why he wore black and why he was the man in black.
Yeah, we should end the segment with that. And why did he wear black? And he has a great song called Man in Black. It's probably one of my all-time favorite songs. But he talks about how it's a symbol of him identifying with people who have been oppressed, people who have gone through difficulties in their life, and that he's kind of a public reminder that these people are among us. They're not invisible, that we need to see them. And I think if I look at the larger context of his life, he was saying the gospel is for them too.
Right, and that's such a beautiful point to make, is that, you know, the marginalized, the oppressed, those who are dealing with injustices, that they're seen and that the gospel's for them. Yeah. And that's what Johnny Cash was about.
Yeah, he was.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for talking about this. If you want to hear more about just the importance of music and how we can use that to evangelize and share the gospel, visit reasons.org and search for Let the Music Play. Now we're going to head over to Give and Take, where Dr. Anjeanette Roberts is going to answer the question, should we wipe out malaria? Let's check it out.
Hello, Jeff Zwerink, and welcome again to Give and Take, the segment of our show where we look at important scientific ideas and how they interact with the truth of Christianity. Today I'm joined by molecular biologist Anjeanette Roberts, and we are going to answer the question, should we use genetics to wipe out malaria? AJ, good to have you back on the set again.
Good to be here, Jeff.
So this is, malaria is obviously a pretty serious disease, and I've been reading about these technologies called gene drives that have the potential to wipe malaria out. So let's kind of dig in. What is a gene drive? Help us understand what the technology is about.
So a gene drive is a way of manipulating the genetics of an animal or a crop in such a way that you're getting positive selection, a preferred selection for a gene of interest. If you wait on Mendelian genetics to take place, you can't actually saturate a population with a particular gene sequence in a very rapid fashion. But you can
you're going to have multiple generations for it to spread out and populate. This does it more rapidly somehow.
It does it much more rapidly because you're actually introducing machinery that will copy that gene not just into the place that you've introduced it, but into each place that that gene should appear in every chromosome of every offspring. And so if the gene drive's working well, you actually have the mechanisms there for cutting, copying, and pasting and repairing the other copy that didn't get a copy of the gene that you wanted to actually duplicate the gene that you did.
So you have, we've talked before about this CRISPR-Cas9, which allows you to go in and edit genes. Is this just that, or is it something beyond that?
It is that, but it's that with very clever design as to how you introduce it into the germline. So you don't just use that technology to introduce the change into the germline. You introduce into the germline a copy of the technology itself, so that the endonuclease is actually there and can actually cleave the other copy in a paired chromosome.
So it's going to make sure that both chromosomes have it in the offspring.
That's right. As long as the cutting's efficient and the repair mechanism is a homologous repair as opposed to just an in-joining repair, then yes, you'll get copies in both. And then that way it gets passed on to all progeny. And even if just one copy gets passed on to the progeny, the machinery works the same in the progeny, actually making another copy and repairing it in the progeny as well, the offspring.
So it seems like a pretty robust process. Have we actually made these things that have worked?
We have in the lab.
In the lab.
Absolutely. So they've done it in mice, and they've done it in mosquitoes and flies and several different organisms.
So when we're talking about, malaria affects a lot of people, kills a lot of people throughout the world each year. I'm not sure what the number is, but I know it's millions or better, I would
hundreds
imagine.
Of thousands every year.
Okay.
Yes.
So this, so the article I was looking at has the technology where we could develop it to actually wipe out the particular mosquito that carries the malaria, correct?
Right. So there are different ways you can apply the technology. You could try and introduce something into a mosquito that would actually spread through the mosquito population that would make the mosquito immune or resistant to malaria, or unable to transmit the malaria even if it had it. Or you could actually do what's called like a population crash, where you're actually introducing infertility into the mosquitoes themselves, preventing the female mosquitoes from biting, and actually crash the population where you actually wipe out an entire species of mosquitoes.
So this is wiping out malaria by wiping out mosquitoes?
That's one approach, yes.
I mean, do we get rid of all mosquitoes? There's part of that would be very pleasant because I grew up where you had a lot of mosquitoes.
Right.
Is that what we're talking about?
We're not talking about getting rid of all mosquitoes. There are
Okay.
over 3,500 different species of mosquitoes. Only about 200 harass humans and animals. And of those, only mosquitoes from the Anopheles complex actually transmit malaria. So you're talking about targeting probably 3 or 4 different species of mosquitoes.
Okay, but we're talking about actually wiping out these mosquitoes. So this is not just dealing with the malaria, we're dealing with it by getting rid of...
Again, it depends on which type of strategy you use for your gene drive, but one is to, yes, entirely crash the mosquito population. Get rid of Anopheles mosquitoes that transmit malaria.
So is this a good thing? I mean, I know we're talking about invasive species that you could modify or deal with. It seems like in some sense we might just end up causing other problems, or another invasive species, if you will.
That's certainly true. I mean, we don't always have perfect vision when we start to tackle problems like this. So if you wipe out Anopheles in sub-Saharan Africa, will something else drastic happen or take its place that's even worse than Anopheles? Probably not, in light of how many people are dying, even within a couple of minutes, how many people will die from malaria.
So it seems like there's two other questions I'd like to ask. One is, if we develop these gene drives, do we have the capacity to control them? And the follow-up I'm going to have to that is, how do we think about this as a Christian? How do we use this technology that can maybe utilize the benefits, but avoids the negative consequences that seem to almost be inevitable with them?
So it really depends, I think, on what species you're targeting and what type of gene drive you're using. So the one with the mosquitoes has a real potential to actually wipe out the mosquito population in a very relatively short amount of time, because you can get through 2 generations of a mosquito within a month. And within 7 to 11 generations, you could probably wipe out the mosquito population. And so, yes, but we have ways of controlling it. We can actually go in and reverse engineer the gene drives, and gene drives that move more slowly through a population because they don't reproduce so rapidly, or it takes longer to get to an age of sexual reproduction. You can easily detect a gene drive in an organism if you look for it. And so that's true whether it's a crop or a mosquito or a mouse or whatever. And so you can monitor for these things. We can certainly give as much thought as we can to potential outcomes and go slowly. And I think that's important.
Well, so that kind of leads into my final question. How, particularly as Christians, but how should we think about these? Because you could have one reaction of, oh, these are awful, let's not do them, or full speed ahead, who cares what the consequences? It seems like there's got to be somewhere between those two extremes to look at this.
I think we can tackle the question with a lot of forethought and responsibility. And I actually think the group at MIT, led in part by a guy named Kevin Esvelt, is actually doing that. They actually have ethicists that are weighing in. They actually have conversations with communities where they might actually try and wipe out a particular invasive species through the CRISPR gene editing, gene drive technology. And so go slowly, think about all of the possible scenarios that we can think of, talk to it, talk to people about it who might be affected by it, hear their questions and concerns, and as you hear their questions and concerns, you think of possibly even more scenarios that you need to run through. And so, yes, I think we can do it very cautiously, as long as we're not rushing in. I don't think anybody's really going to rush in. It can be very expensive to even set it up through CRISPR technology, and nobody wants to go in and set something up that utterly fails and shuts down the research for everybody in every field.
That's fair. Well, thanks, AJ. I appreciate your comments.
Thanks, Jeff.
You know, we do live in a world that there are problems that we can solve with technology, and we kind of do have two extremes. We can either just eschew the technology or say it's bad, or we can go without thinking. But as a Christian, we really do have a great worldview that allows us to use the gifts that God has put before us in a way that's wise and advances His kingdom. I would encourage you to go check out AJ's blog on this. She's got a question, answering questions about gene editing technologies so that you can be better equipped to talk about this fascinating area of research with those God brings across your path.
Well, that's a wrap on this episode of 2819.
We hope that you've enjoyed having Krista Bontrager as a co-host again. And we hope that this episode has encouraged you to go out and share your faith and to do so with confidence and compassion and maybe a little cash reference in there.
And I want to encourage you to reach out and support this ministry. 2819 doesn't just happen on its own. It is the direct result of what you, our viewers, have sown into this. And if you would like to partner with us, please do so at reasons.org/2819.
And I want to just add a quick note. If you are already supporting us, thank you so much for keeping this show alive. And you know what? We're also alive on social media, so we'd love to connect with you. You can see what we're up to, see some behind the scenes things. We are at 2819 Show on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Bye-bye.
Bye.